He says he doesn't have experience. Another way of saying that, Mr. Speaker, is that he has no conflicts of interest. He's not wedded to any of the stakeholders who come before the CRTC, who are dealing with important issues of convergence and copyright, dealing with issues of digital transition. He doesn't have any of those conflicts of interest. He's a qualified, effective, bilingual, thoughtful person who will do a great job at the CRTC.
That's the Heritage Minister, James Moore, in QP today. And the minister is referring to, is the newly government-appointed vice chair of the CRTC, someone named Tom Pentafountas. He's a Montreal lawyer, he's a businessman, he's a former president of the ADQ in Quebec, and he just happens to be a friend of the PMO Communications Director, Dimitri Soutes. Question, is Pentafountas' seemingly little broadcast experience and few ties to the industry actually a strength, as the Minister, James Moore, was just saying, or has the new appointment hurt the CRTC's credibility? And there's lots of fights about the CRTC. We're going to get into that right now with the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, Dean Del Mastro. He's here. The Liberal industry critic, Mark Garneau, is here. And the NDP Heritage critic, Charlie Angus, is here. And Charlie Angus, let me start with you. You brought this up today in the House. We saw that clip of you. The Minister says this guy's, and he said he's thoughtful, he's intelligent, he's independent, and he's the man for the job. What's your problem with this appointment?
Well, what really struck me from the Minister's comments today is he mustn't have read the Gazette that was put out in terms of the qualifications for this position. Saying that Tom Pentafountas has no background in broadcast might make him an outsider. In some areas that might be a good thing. But what the government asked for was a very clear set of criteria. Extensive experience in quasi-judicial forms, extensive background in terms of cultural policy, broadcast issues. Mr. Pentafountas has none of this. So I think it's incumbent upon the Minister and this government to explain how is it that someone who's very closely tied to to one of the key people in the PMO, which is Dimitri Soutes, is now the Vice Chair of Broadcast. How did that happen?
So what are you insinuating? I mean, this is the question. Are you insinuating that it was a political appointment at an arm's-length institution? Well,
I was called on this issue last December. I asked the Minister about it. He ridiculed the suggestion that Tom Pentafountas was being chosen. I was being called by people within the industry who were saying, what is going on? We have an independent body. We have had very qualified candidates come forward. None of them were chosen. Suddenly, the word on the street was that Mr. Pentafountas was the guy chosen. So, did they follow proper protocol? How was he picked? And if we can't answer that, then the question will be very clear. Did the PMO deliberately intervene in an independent body that is supposed to adjudicate over a business industry worth $60 billion? It's a very serious issue for them to address.
I mean, this goes to arm's length and the independence of the CRTC, Dean Del Mastro, and you think, you know, obviously there's allegations that there's political meddling here. What's your response to his appointment and these allegations?
Well, first of all, I think that, you know, the Minister was pretty clear. We've hired an articulate, bilingual gentleman from Quebec to sit on the CRTC to represent Canadians. And I think Mr. Pentafountas, on a whole range of levels, is eminently qualified for this position. And, you know, I also think that, you know, we talk about arm's-length organization, the CRTC. Listen, it seems in minority politics, we don't believe in arm's-length organizations anymore. Everything comes up for debate. Everything is challenged with respect to whether or not somebody is qualified or not qualified.
But shouldn't he? I mean, in this case, his resume doesn't look like a guy who is deeply interested in the past in telecom and broadcast and media issues that are regulated by the CRTC. Is that fair?
Well, his resume is an awful lot stronger than an awful lot of people that sit in Parliament who are elected by the people of Canada to actually preside over many of the laws that govern this country.
What's the bar? But Charlie Angus is saying there's a process and to be followed. Was the process followed fairly?
Yes, absolutely. What we've done is we've brought someone in. We have to respect a number of things when you're making appointments to an important body like the CRTC. Certainly one of them is to make sure that you've got adequate regional representation at the CRTC that will ensure that Canadians are accurately and aptly reflected in that body. And I think Mr. Pentafountas does represent that for the CRTC. He's a very, very qualified individual who's worked on a whole number of, you mentioned his education. His education is outstanding. I think he'll do an outstanding job at the CRTC, so does the Minister.
Let's hear Mark Garneau. What concerns you about this and perhaps the larger issue here, which is the relationship between the CRTC, and we've talked about the user-based billing regarding the Internet, the overturning of the telecom decision when it comes to Wind Mobile and that. What's your concern about this, Mark Garneau?
Well, I'm not going to pass judgment on Mr. Pentafountas. I don't know him. I don't pass judgments on people that I don't know. I hope he will do a good job. I hope he'll be impartial. The bigger issue, the much bigger issue, the CRTC is working in a policy vacuum. It needs to have guidance in order to make the right decisions that are consistent with what the government wants. But the government is not telling it what to do. I mean, we can go back to 2006 when Mr. Bernier issued some guidance about taking a more market-based approach. But the reality is that, unfortunately, without that guidance, the government often has to overturn the CRTC. It did so on Global Live. Last week, a federal court, of course, reversed that decision. We had said from the beginning in the Liberal Party that the CRTC had made the right decision. In that case, it wasn't an issue with policy. It was simply a bad decision. But in the case of usage-based billing, the CRTC is trying to interpret what it's supposed to do, but really what it needs is some guidance. And in the meantime, we've got the minister talking about his digital strategy. Where is it? What are we going to do with respect to foreign ownership? What are we going to do with respect to the Telecommunications Act?
You want to respond to that? Because I want to get to this other issue as well. But Dean Del Mastro, the Liberals, and Mark Garneau has been on the show last week saying CRTCs are working in a policy vacuum. They're not getting direction. They make a decision and they're getting overturned. And there's questions about, does that undermine its credibility?
Well, no, I don't think it undermines the CRTC's credibility, but I think we have to recognize that we are operating in a highly charged political environment. And from time to time, you know what, I think there were times in the past where governments also disagreed with decisions that the CRTC made. And, you know, one area that I think that, frankly, all parties do a good job of staying out of is the awarding of licenses, which is something that the CRTC does, which I think needs to, inherently, it must be beyond political interference. And I think they do a good job on that.
Over the government's decision to award a license to Wind Mobile.
But let's be clear. No, I mean broadcast licenses.
Okay.
Now, let's be clear. I think that the, if we look, for example, at the UBB issue last week on the internet, clearly the CRTC had came down in a position that consumers let us know, and let us know very forcefully, that they did not agree with the CRTC's position on that, and the government acted very quickly to indicate that we would overturn that decision. I think that's government working. Now, with respect to the appointments process, or I think that we appoint the best possible people that can come forward. I'm proud of the appointments we make. We appoint qualified people. And with respect to digital strategy, as Mr. Garneau has articulated, I think we've been very engaged with the community, with the technical, with all of the people in the industry, and we are very much looking to move forward with that. Well, let's be clear. If we can't pass a copyright bill in this country, it's going to be very difficult to meet all of the challenges that are coming forward with respect to digital strategy, because we are not meeting the regulatory requirements that will allow for a digital economy in this country.
Fold your responses into this, because I really want to get this in while we have the time, because there's another controversy around the CRTC, and really quickly, they're looking to change the definition of what's considered false and misleading news, okay, when it comes to print. And you mentioned broadcast media, Dean Del Mastro. Let me show you an amendment really quickly, and I'll show it to our audience. Here's an amendment that is supposed to take effect September 1st, and if we just have it, Jerry, the board, any news that the licensee knows is false or misleading and that endangers or is likely to endanger lives, health, or safety of the public. Charlie Angus, you tried to get the Heritage Committee to look into this story. What is your issue with this thing?
Well, the real concern we have here, they were advised by the Regulatory Committee of Parliament to just look at the language to make sure it met legal standards. What we're looking at here in terms of lowering the bar could have many, many unintended consequences in terms of, you see what's happened in the United States in the aftermath of the Gifford shooting. Does putting a bullseye on a politician's head, does that knowingly endanger someone's life, or is that fair comment from a license holder? The concern I have here, and this is, I'm sort of surprised at Mr. Garneau saying that CRTC needs some advice. the CRTC was told very clearly by the Conservative government not to intervene in decisions, to let the market make the decisions. That was a fundamental shift in the CRTC's job, which was to protect the public interest. Since then, there's been a whole series of deregulatory decisions that have resulted in higher prices, less choice, hence the UBB billing. So now we're looking at actually deregulating the obligation of large television and radio holdings in order to ensure that there's a basic obligation for accuracy in the news.
So you're just saying, I mean, because I want a couple second response. The argument is, Charlie Angus making, and I wonder if you agree, Mark Garneau, that it would allow news outlets basically to broadcast things that may not be the truth and have no consequence. In other words, and some people say this throws the door open to any kind of partisanship without any basis in fact. What's your view?
I'm very concerned when there's any perception that we are lowering the bar in terms of standards for truth and honesty. So my initial reaction to this is to be concerned.
And is that the case? Is Charlie Angus and Mark, are they characterizing this right? And if so, what's the government's view on this?
Well, here's my own view, and we just actually debated this at committee a few minutes ago. I'm concerned that this could be perceived to be an attack on free speech in this country, and I do think that we have attacks on free speech, or we have witnessed some attacks on free speech, and I don't want to see that come to outlets like the CBC, where they feel that they can't report a story because they're concerned about what their regulatory requirements may be. I do think...
Have we had that in the past? No. Do you think the current climate already inhibits free speech, or do you think you need to widen the ability to say anything further?
Well, I would argue that there have been incidents recently where there have been, certainly I've had constituents come forward with concerns indicating that they feel that free speech is under attack in the country. So I think that we do need to be mindful of this. I think we need to allow for divergent views. I do believe, as Mr. Angus would indicate, that allowing news organizations to broadcast something that they just know isn't true, frankly, I have a problem with that too. But we have to allow for diverse views and people to be able to speak freely.
I can't allow for any more views, but it has nothing to do with censorship. It has to do with time. I appreciate you, all three of you gentlemen, coming on today. That's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, Dean Del Mastro, the Liberal industry critic, Mark Garneau, and the NDP Heritage critic, Charlie Angus. Gents, thanks a lot.
Thank you so
Lots
much.
more to be said on this.